Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 14th Hazelmere Climate Talk. We're delighted to have Penelope Tollett with us today, who's going to be giving the talk. Just in context, before we get started, Hazelmere Parish Council declared a climate emergency at the beginning of 2020 and set a 2030 net zero target for the community. We are already working on it. We have a number of people now working on a 2030 net zero plan. And we have a climate emergency working party which organises these talks and does a lot of other things. Now we have to put the talk today into the context of the international and national news you've been seeing. So floods in London Underground stations, floods in Germany, Belgium and Holland, massive heat waves happening, forest fires, 107 of them across Turkey currently, and people being evacuated off beaches into boats. And the heat wave in Canada, in places that are on the same latitude as we are, having a 1,000-year heat wave, which climate scientists are saying will now happen 150 times more likely due to climate change. So that's less than once every 7 years. So we can certainly look forward to some hotter weather coming to us here, as well as what they're seeing in Canada. Now, we are also running out of carbon budgets. We know from what the UN gave us as our maximum carbon budget for the planet in 2017, that now every individual on the planet only has a carbon budget of 32 tons each. And when we go beyond that, we are polluting the planet beyond its opportunity to stay under 1.5 degrees. So that's all we have left. And the context of this talk is that building a house, one house, is about 80 tons of carbon emissions. So one house built will be producing two people's carbon emissions immediately for that one house. So in the context of that, and just reminding everybody that we'll be prioritising questions related to neighbourhood plans and climate change or the environment or biodiversity, please do ask your questions straight away as we're going through. Now, I'd like to welcome Penelope Tollett. And Penelope is a committed environmentalist, has been trying to work in her private life on climate initiatives for very many years, is part of the Climate Emergency Working Party in Hazelmere, is head of the equivalent group in Wickham, and now chair of the subcommittee of the, or vice chair of the subcommittee of the community boards and related to climate change and environment. And she's also the ex-head of planning and sustainability for Wickham District Council. So Penelope, over to you.
Hello, Ed. Thanks very much. It's very disappointing to me to see how many of you are here. It's fantastic. There are nearly 40. I'm afraid I didn't get as much time over the weekend to prepare for this as I might have liked. It's a very text-heavy presentation, and I know that from I know quite a few faces, and a number of you are committed environmentalists, and you might find the presentation a bit tame, but that's because the planning system is rather tame when it comes to these matters. So I will share my screen. And I apologise, as I've just said, for the fact that it's very, very text heavy. So let's see if this works. Hopefully you can see that. And if I do that, hopefully you can just see the screen. As Ed said, please do, I'm quite happy if you want to interrupt and ask a quick question. It may be better to keep questions till the end. It's quite difficult on Zoom.
Preferably put the questions in the chat and then we'll review them from the top at the end.
Okay, fine. So what I'm going to be doing is dealing with three things. What's a neighbourhood plan, which I will skirt over. Why isn't planning driving the changes that we so desperately need to see? And what are some of the things that we might be doing? But just to be clear what hat I'm wearing tonight. So I am, as Ed has said, a member of his group, his Hazelmere climate emergency group. Although I live in the middle of High Wycombe, we are generous in our use of boundaries for these things. But I am also now working for Hazelmere Parish Council on the neighbourhood plan, but I'm not being employed for its content, I'm being employed for its engagement. So it's my job to try and get people in Hazelmere engaged in doing the plan. It's not my job to advise what goes in that plan. So I am today, this evening, very firmly wearing my voluntary hat of being part of the Climate Emergency Working Party. So what is a neighbourhood plan? Many of you know this because I can see some of you on the call are already doing neighbourhood plans. It's something that's prepared at a local level, usually by a parish council. There is normally a need for some professional advice, and there's a great deal of volunteer input as well. And what it does, as with any other plan, whether it's a district level plan or whatever, it sets out the rules that are then used to assess planning applications. It is probably narrower in scope, therefore, than many of you would imagine. It is constrained by the same planning law as any local plan that is prepared by the district council. And again, that's something that's quite important to understand. I was going to say it's sad but true. It's actually happy but true. It's not the planners in local government that are the reason why you get plans that you don't think are really any good. It's the planning system. So it's the same system, whether it's a neighbourhood plan or a district plan. It's important that it's evidence-based, it's deliverable, and it's financially viable. There are other tests I could have gone into, but that's sort of in the nutshell. You can't want something to happen just because you want it enough. You can't will into existence something if it doesn't work under the system, and you can't overburden a development with stuff in order to make it not happen, because that doesn't work under the rules. And it has to conform to strategic policies in the local plan and in the national planning policy framework. It has to do other things too, but I thought those were the main headlines. So I'm not going to talk anymore now about what a neighbourhood plan is and how you go about doing one. What I am going to do, though, is show you my one and only picture, which is of the parish of Hazelmere, with a very rough boundary. That's not exactly right, that boundary. I've just drawn it on freehand over at the top of a Google satellite map, partly to make the point of how bizarre it is the way we do planning, because why do you have policies on this side of the line and policies on this side of the line that are different when they're, you know, the same place? Well, you just do. It's the way that planning works. You don't have to do a neighbourhood plan on a parish boundary, but the world stops somewhere, and you know, wherever you decide to draw the line, there will be someone on the other side of it that has a different set of policies. And the other reason for showing this slide, of course, is that in Hazlemere, you have two really quite significant development sites, which are set in the local plan. So that's already gone through the system, and it cannot be undone in your neighbourhood plan. You might choose to try and influence what happens, but the planning applications are already in the system, or some of them are anyway. So the chances of being able to do that in terms of timing are not very great. So let me trundle on to the next slide and tell you why planning is so behind with all this climate change stuff. Well, first of all, you'll all be thinking, planning deals with buildings, it deals with transport, it deals with energy use in buildings. Of course, it does all these things, doesn't it? That's what planning does, except that it doesn't. So it doesn't deal with all buildings, because most buildings are built. Planning deals with the things that we are about to build. It deals with development. So fundamentally, it's about new build. And of course, actually, it's just worth going back to that slide of Hazlemere. Most of that development is already there. You know, Hazlemere exists as a community, the buildings are already built. And yes, there are those two orange rectangles where there's going to be significant new development, but as a proportion of the whole place, even though you're getting quite a lot of development compared to some other communities, it's actually, it's a small part. Now, of course, there's extensions and there are other modifications. I'm not suggesting that it's only that bit that it applies to, but it is only the new build. It doesn't directly deal with transport. It only deals with transport in terms of choosing where location is where development is located. So you're not going to build a new housing estate in a field in the middle of the countryside that doesn't have a bus service and doesn't even have a road, for example. You know, you're not going to get there only by foot across the fields. So you take into account how you get access to the area before you build. You propose that anything is built there, but you don't, through the planning system, have any levers on the bus service. You don't have any levers even directly on how the highway is split up between the uses for cars, pedestrians, cyclists, because that's something that's dealt with under the Highways Act by the Highway Authority. And then we get to energy use in buildings, and that, I should say, in new buildings, and that is a matter for building control. Or it should be a matter for building control, but our dear friend Eric Pickles, back in 2015, he made a pickle. He made a pickle of the system. He introduced a written ministerial statement, which he had the perfect right to do. And he told planners to no longer put in plans anything to do with the amount of energy that is going to be emitted from buildings, because that was all going to be dealt with by building control. And they said at the time of the ministerial statement, it would be in a forthcoming act that then didn't happen. So having told us to keep our hands off, he then didn't do what he was going to do. And actually, it's even more complicated than that, because we could have done what he told us we weren't to do, because he didn't do what he then said he was meant to be doing. But what it signalled to those of us that were working in planning at the time, and I hold my hands up, as I was in a position of influence in Wickham District Council at the time, the signal to me was, you can't do this in planning. So many of us in positions of influence at the time just backed off and thought, okay, it's going to be dealt with by building control. If in 2015 we would realise that in 2021 there would still be no meaningful carbon targets through the building control system, I dare say we would have all said, well, hang on a minute, is there a way that we can do this? But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and we had no idea that it would be quite so laggardly as it has been. Two other reasons why planning is so behind. One of them is the National Planning Policy Framework. I've already made reference to it. It was, whether it was weak or whether it was not sufficiently clear, you could debate, but it's only in the last fortnight, or is it 3 weeks, that a new edition of the framework has been brought out that puts the need to deal with climate change in the opening paragraphs of the document, if I can put it that way. Previously, there was a reference to us needing to make radical reductions in carbon dioxide emissions, but it was buried down at paragraph 147 or something like that, rather than being up in the strategy. It is now there in the strategy. And the other thing I just want to mention is this old saying from management that what gets measured gets done. What was being measured by the planning system, by the various governments over the last decade, was all about housing numbers. It had been reduced to a debate that really felt as though we'd gone back into the 1980s. I actually wasn't practicing as a planner in the 1980s, but as I began to get my feet under the table in the 1990s, I could hear people talking about the way it was all about housing numbers. And we went back into those days. And so everyone was just focusing on what was being measured. And that's really why planning has not got to grips with this. And of course, there were perverse consequences of numbers not being met, which is partly why Hazelmere has got those two orange packages I drew a line around earlier on the plan. So why am I suggesting that we can do anything at all? What's changed? Well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure that much has changed. However, there are some things that have changed, and I think it's worth, therefore, the planning system seeing if it can have another go. So one thing that has changed is we've had the 6th carbon budget issued, and the government has responded to that budget by saying they're going to cut 78% of our carbon emissions by 2035. This is all a bit shorthand, and I'm assuming that many of you on the call know enough about what I'm talking about to fill in some of the blanks. If I'm leaving you behind, pop something in the chat. I'm not saying that they've said that that's a planning thing. That 78% is the whole government basis, but clearly if the government's going to achieve that, then the planning system that is responsible for dealing with new build buildings must have a part to play in that, surely, one would think. Many councils have declared climate emergencies, and one of the things you do is in making a plan is take into account what the strategy is for your council for the place as a whole. And therefore, clearly, if your council has decided that a climate emergency if climate is of sufficient importance to declare an emergency, that will have an influence on what policies you therefore want to put in place to manage your place over the future. And I've already mentioned this, that the NPPF has changed, so it is now referencing mitigating and adapting to climate change early in the document. And this last one I've sort of thrown in there, but it's relevant even though we're not in the Oxcam ARC area. I'll explain what that is in a minute. I'll explain it now. The Oxcam ARC is the area between, it's Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Northamptonshire, the ex-Bedfordshire area, and Cambridge and Peterborough. So that arc from Oxford and Cambridge and a bit beyond. And the government is preparing a strategic plan for that area. And it published a vision a week or so ago. And I may be reading too much into this, but the chapters are organised with the environment before economy, which frankly, a year ago wouldn't have been the case. And in that chapter on environment, it is asking about how do we get to zero carbon. And I think that is highly significant because this is a planning document. This isn't a government vision in other spheres. This is directly relating to planning. So if we now as a community in Hazlemere are not able to do things to do with carbon, then we really have a broken planning system. It's a pretty broken system, but I'm hopeful that with these changes, there are reasons why we can now do things that perhaps previously we would have felt we were not able to do. So what can we do? Clearly, a lot of the focus is around energy. Just worth bearing in mind that there is two types of energy. You've got embodied energy, which is the energy in the building materials themselves. So to make brick, you have to mine the clay and then you have to fire the brick and so on and so forth. And then you have the operational energy of using the building when it's in operation, when it's in use. Two elements to the operational energy. Of course, the first thing is to reduce the amount of energy that you need to start with before you start bringing in non-carbon sources. And there are various, I'm sure you're aware, but there are various targets to deal with the non-carbon sources, which all feels very much like too little too late, but it's better to mix my metaphors, better late than never. The latest version of the government's plan to deal with carbon emissions and energy emissions through building control is called the Future Home Standard. Now, you'll forgive me if I sound a little bit jaded, but given that so far they have a track record of not doing anything, I'll just fill in a blank on that. Back in, I think it was something like 2008, the then government brought in a system that would have made all new buildings carbon neutral by 2016. And then that was reneged by the new government and nothing else has been put in its place. It's a shorthand way of putting it. So we're now being told that in 2022, all new buildings will have to be 31% reduced. I think that was on a 2002 level, but I might be wrong on that base year, but 31% lower than is standardly done. And by 2025, it's going to be 75 to 80% reduction on what you would otherwise expect in terms of the energy needed in the home. So that's the energy efficiency side of it. But we haven't got anything in hand. So 2022 is not very far away. So learning my lesson from 2015, when Mr. Pickles introduced the statement saying that planners weren't allowed to deal with energy in the home, and then in fact left it that we could because he didn't do what he was meant to have done on that front, I would no longer say don't bother to do anything in your neighbourhood plan, because you might think, well, look, this is so close. By the time we've adopted our neighbourhood plan, it will be 2022. It won't be very long until 2025. You know, we can just leave this to the government. And I'm afraid my view is I'm not sure that we can, because I'm not sure that we're going to get there on the track record of the past. And in any event, this only deals with operational energy. This only deals with the stuff when you're living there. It doesn't deal with making sure that you're using less concrete, more timber, and all the other things that could help reduce the carbon footprint of the building as a whole. So a bit more on energy. Clearly, an extension has embodied energy, and it makes the dwelling a bit bigger, so there's more operational energy too. So if somebody wants to make an extension, could we, this is a question, could we then require the whole house to be retrofitted so that it reduces the amount of energy that the whole house emits? Now, it's worth bearing in mind that the energy performance certificate, which every house has to have before it's sold now, by 2028, I understand that any house for sale on the market by 2028 will have to have a level C certificate. So actually it wouldn't be that unreasonable to require anybody putting an extension to at least get to level C, because they're going to have to do that by 2028 anyway, if they want to sell. It might be that we can go beyond that. It might be that people don't want to go that far, but that's a question for the Hazlemere community to decide. But importantly, and I don't know that this is done very systematically elsewhere, I'm sure there must be some examples of where you actually look at the materials for the extension to be low carbon. So concrete is one of the biggest causes of carbon emissions. I think globally, concrete creates 8% of global emissions. So it's quite a lot. I might be wrong on that. I might have misquoted it, and it might be more, it might be less. But at the moment, most of our built environment is built of concrete in one form or other. There are lower carbon concretes. You could use hempcrete, which isn't quite an equivalent to concrete, but it's a building material that is extremely environmentally friendly. It's more of a replacement for brick, to be honest. But there are timber, if you include it in a way that can be recycled at the end of the building's life, although hopefully you wouldn't be doing that because you'd want to make the building a long-term thing, can actually be regarded as carbon positive rather than even having a carbon footprint of its own. So there's a lot of research to be done. One of the things I should say really is that when as a planner you're wondering what to put in your plan, the first thing you do is just Google and see what other people have done. But because these changes in the NPPF with the 6th carbon budget and so forth have only just come in, yes, it's great to Google and see what other people have done, but actually they may have been working in a more constrained environment. So we might be able to go further than some of those existing examples. But okay, talking about building an extension and the energy of building, picking up what Ed said at the beginning, it's sort of assuming that we're going to carry on building. Are we going to carry on having extensions? So coming back to Hazelmere, this is a plan for Hazelmere. If you've got children who are coming up to the time in life when they want to go off and set up their own home, can they afford to buy a property in Hazelmere? Is there a 1-bedroom flat available for sale in Hazelmere? Do you want to have some 1-bedroom flats available for sale in Hazelmere so that people can live in Hazelmere who are youngsters rather than moving into the town centre and then when they're starting their children moving back out again? These are questions beyond the question about the climate emergency. Another question, perhaps, but going back more to the climate emergency, is that if you install special stuff in a house, how do you know that people are using it? How do you make sure that they know how to, if you've ended up having to put in a ventilation system, how it works? Are they understanding how the recycling works? Are they doing it? Are there things that we need to do to help behaviour change? So it's one thing to build stuff, but then are we helping it to be managed? And there are some standards that we could perhaps dip into if we wanted to be more specific about that, rather than just wait for people to change their low flow taps into normal ones, for example. Transport, another obvious topic for you might think, but as I've already pointed out, transport is sort of indirect. But if there were car clubs in Hazlemere, would people own fewer cars? Now, of course, car clubs don't mean people will still emit their carbon emissions, because car clubs tend to replace second cars, and then you book your car club car and make the journey that you would have made in your own car. So this isn't so much about reducing the carbon from travel, but it does mean we might even get some pavements back. You never know. The amount of parking that takes place on pavements, that means you can't even walk at the moment. If we had more car clubs and fewer people owning second cars, we might have pavements back, we might have space for trees and other things. We might want more electric charging points so that there's a faster shift to electric cars. But even those two things is sort of looking at the world through the old frame, swapping one technology for another technology. Walking and cycling, perhaps we should be putting more emphasis on walking and cycling. What would it take to turn Hazlemere into a walking and cycling village? So that's the priority. So that if you're at the age of 10 and you're going to one of the primary schools, you feel safe, or more to the point, your parents feel safe that you can walk to work, walk to school. When I was a widdy many years ago, I have two older sisters, so admittedly when I was 5 I was catching the bus with my 8-year-old and 10-year-old sisters, but we went to the bus stop on our own. We waited for the bus, we got off at the school and went to the school, because that's what you did in those days. We don't do that now. We don't feel it's remotely safe, and for very good reason. Now, the point to remember with all of this stuff is that this is not directly from you. There's no point in writing into a neighbourhood plan, we will have car clubs, because that's just willing it into being. You have to find the delivery mechanism, and you'd be asking a developer to fund car clubs in order to reduce the amount of second cars. And then they would have some benefit on their developments, because they wouldn't need to provide so many parking spaces, and that means they have more land, whether that's land for extra development or whether that's land for trees and bees is a matter for assessment at the time that you're looking at the development. But it's not just about reducing carbon, as we know. There's a huge amount that we could do on wildlife corridors. In Hazlemere, you've got the Kingswood to the south, which hardly gets into the parish, but is just there. And then you've got Grange Farm to the north of that. And they've got Terriers, which in theory, when that's developed, the hedge, and I should go back to a plan. Let me just, I'll save this thought and we'll go back to a plan afterwards, perhaps, and look at it a bit more site specific. You've got issues with flooding. Now, okay, you're on the top of a hill, but you've got a few valleys. You're on a clay because you're Hazlemere, so there must be clay around, because otherwise you wouldn't be called Hazlemere. So in 20 years' time, is the flooding all going to be fine, or are we going to find that actually there are things we need to be doing to deal with that? The more greenery we can get within the urban environment, the more comfortable it's going to be to live in that urban environment. I went round Poets Corner. Many of you are local. You'll know Poets Corner in High Wycombe is the estate that's up behind the hospital. I went leaflet dropping, trying to encourage people to install solar power, actually, by chance. But it was one of those a fortnight or so ago, we had that really hot weather. And it was really striking to me how the houses that I went to the front doors, where they've got wall-to-wall paving on their front garden, were so hot. And there was one that was wonderful. It had a big tree and an overgrown hedge, and you sort of went in under this overgrown hedge, and there was grass and all sorts of shrubs, and it felt like an absolute oasis. And all it was different planting in the same street. So the role that can play is massive. And as the urban heat island effect really kicks off as the temperatures rise, we're going to need that sort of thing more. But something else, it's beginning to become very fashionable to talk about, the circular economy. Can we apply that to development? It's a very much longer cycle than it is for normal consumer goods, but there's no reason why not. And that might give us a way of getting round this long debate about whether we can or cannot put energy efficiency measures in the local plan. Because the one thing of the neighbourhood plan, the one thing we don't want to do is put things in the plan and then find that as we get to the examination process, it all starts getting tied down and people start objecting to it. The developers don't like it because then it slows everything up. So that might just be another way of dealing with it. And the circular economy is about trying to make sure it's not just about recycling, although that's a big part of it. And when you demolish your home, can you take it away and actually effectively not have perhaps to say not know the home was there is a bit too far of a stretch, but can you reuse all the components? Can you take the bricks apart and reuse them, rather than is so often the case now, you knock your brick wall down, but because they're all stuck together with concrete, it takes too long to be bothered to split them all apart and reuse them. Are there things that we can do on that actually gives us the same benefit, that counting the actual amount of energy needed to heat a home? Would that be another way around? And I've already mentioned size of homes. Do we want more extensions? Do we want smaller homes? What about businesses? Do we want more facilities locally? There's a huge amount of stuff to be debated and discussed about what goes in the plan. And if it's not just about carbon, it's not just about the environment either. So really, wrapping up, the question about a neighbourhood plan is, what sort of place do you want Hazlemere to be? There will be in that a mix of generic policies and some site specifics. I began to wax lyrical on the site specifics when I was imagining my map, but I'll calm myself down, not talk about that. But where do you want, is there a badger trail that runs through the village? And if there is, we'll know where it is, and we can identify that specifically and work out what the specific measures are. Other things, going back to energy, it'll be more of a generic approach because it's a global problem. So there's not a site-specific measure to that. Although there could be a site-specific measure, because it's as much about the orientation of dwellings as it is about what they're built of and whether you've got a gas boiler or an air source heat pump. Of course, if you start with the question, what sort of place do you want Hazlemere to be? Not all of that material will end up in the neighbourhood plan. So as I said at the beginning, the neighbourhood plan deals with the things that work under the Planning Act. It's a specific area. There'll be other things, principally around transport, perhaps to do with land management, that's not that wouldn't come out through the Planning Acts. They would have to go into other plans and strategies. And the critical point to all of them is making sure that you don't just write it, you write it in a way that actually makes it happen. And I think that's the last slide. It is. So I will stop share and we'll see what's in the chat. Lots of questions. Oh my goodness me. Ed, you better...
Thank you so much, Penelope. That's great. Yes, we'll sort of start from the top, but what we're going to do, if people don't mind, we're going to gloss over the non-environmental ones to begin with. And if we keep getting those related to the neighbourhood plan, we'll keep going. We'll come back to some of the other ones. So let's just come up now to... Okay. So Jane's comment, central government controls alterations to planning system, but they've no interest, it appears, in a carbon neutral negative plan. How can pressure be exerted to change political thinking other than turning over this government? What can we do at our town and parish council level, even if it's only to slow stuff down or make people think? And I think probably to say, would you like to address that first from a sort of planning perspective, if there is anything, and then after that from a sort of personal opinion perspective, maybe?
Yeah, and I think actually, Jane, this is the moment to test whether we can use the planning system in a way that we haven't up to this point. So that was the point about the fact the NPPF has recently changed. The government, the sixth carbon budget is now unequivocal in what we need to do, and the government has accepted that as a target. I know we had the fifth carbon budget and that didn't seem to count, but perhaps we can argue that this is. So I think that we need to, if there is the political will, and this comes down in the end to our choices and the choice of obviously, because this is about Hazelmere parish and the people that are on the lay members of the committee, if I can put it that way. How far do you want to go? How much of the envelope are you willing to stretch? Are you willing to try and indeed get out of that envelope? It's entirely a choice, and then we'll look back, or rather the person that's doing the content of the plan will look back and say, well, actually, I can see that would work within the system quite nicely. This is looking as though you could well get into trouble over that. Do you really want to do that, or could you do something else instead? So I think this is the time to really see if we can push the planning system to do something that, frankly, it should have been doing 25 years ago, as well as what we might want to do individually in the ballot box.
Can I just follow up on that just very quickly, Ed?
Go ahead, Jane.
I mean, bearing in mind there's a group of us here who are town councillors from Princess Risborough. I mean, we would dearly like to object to applications as they come through, but we really can't do that because there's no standard that we can hang our objections on. You've already highlighted building regulations, and there are no other standards other than these commitments to cutting carbon, you know, as you've mentioned, but we can't use those to object.
No. So this is the way the system is constructed. And going back to the plan of Hazelmere with the 2 orange-yellow blobs, which are its equivalent to your extension at Princess Risborough, and a planning application that comes through is assessed against the local plan or neighbourhood plan that is in place at the time. Now, it also should take into account the NPPF, but the NPPF hasn't changed in terms of the tests that it's asking to be applied when on decision taking, as it calls it. It's asked the plan to take better account of climate change, and then that takes time to work through the system. So now I'm afraid, wearing my firm and boring planning hat, planning application you get in today, you can't say no, you can't do it because climate change is too much of an issue under the system. You might feel that you've got some political leverage and you might want to take that angle, but that's a political choice. That you might cause some disruption, but in the end you're not going to stop it. You might delay it long enough until there are policies that then would allow you to require that, but it's unlikely to be successful, to be honest.
And what about, I'm sorry, this is really the last thing I'm going to say. What about sort of, you know, motivating people at grassroots level around that narrative? You know, this is what we've got to do. We've got to slow things down until the system catches up with the crisis we're in.
So I think you might be able to do that, but something else you might want to do, and it depends, I'm not close to what's happening in Risborough now, so I'm not sure how many planning applications you've actually got in, or whether you're still waiting to get those applications in. But if you think there is something like a year between now and those applications being determined, then if you put your mind to it, you could do a neighbourhood plan just around climate change issues, policies, that would then mean that those planning applications had to take those policies into account before they were determined, because you'd have changed the planning rules. So I would say that was the way to use your energy in a positive way, if there is the time. And it may be that you haven't got that luxury.
So just to make that clear for everybody who's on, so you're saying that to alter some of these developments that are sort of in progress prior to the date of determination, so when they're finally granted, if the neighbourhood plan had come in by then, it would have an effect, or could.
Yes, so the way the planning system works, it sounds very strange to people that aren't used to it, but the way it works is that any decision that is taken on any application, you take that decision based on the rules that are in place on that day. So if the NPPF changes the day before you're going to take a decision on a planning application, you have to rewrite your report, go back over it, and make that decision in the light of the new NPPF, not the one that was around the day before. So if you've got a planning application in, and most large applications take longer than their 3 months to determine, if you can get your new plan in place before the date of determination, even if it's only adopted the day before, then those houses have to take that new plan into account. But it's a game of cat and mouse. And it's a game as a chief planner that I played often, sometimes with effect and sometimes without effect. You try and get the guidance in before the decision is actually taken.
Stuart, you did put your hand up, but just before you do, Catherine had asked a related question. You've mentioned it now quite a few times again. Can you just briefly retell us what the NPPF is?
Sorry.
What its general effect is? You did already mention it, but just to make it clear for everybody.
So the
Sorry. I muted you by mistake, Penelope. You'll have to...
that's a good thing. I need to be muted.
Myself off.
I need to be muted. The NPPF is the National Planning Policy Framework. It is the thing the government writes, and that every plan that is written by whatever authority, whether it's a neighbourhood plan or a district or a unitary or whatever, all have to conform to, or have a very good reason why, on terms of local distinctiveness, you can do something different to what the national policy requires. But the shorthand is the Bible. We all do what it says, because otherwise life is very complicated. What was the other bit of the question, Ed?
Well, that's actually fine. I think I'll just add on to that then. You had also mentioned how the NPPF had just last week been changed in relation to climate. And knowing that the change was pretty general and non-specific, that presumably is potentially allowing us all a big leeway to challenge things.
That's my view. Now, if you talk to 3 different planners and you'll get 7 different opinions, because actually so much of planning is about judgment and how things weigh. But the fact that now in the NPPF, it's something like paragraph 11. So it's at the beginning when the NPPF is talking about the big things that should be taken into account, and climate change, mitigation and adaptation is now up there, and it hasn't been previously. So the NPPF was first written in 2012. We used to have dozens of individual topic guidance before then, which was great because nobody ever knew what was in them, so anybody could do what they liked. But it wasn't great still. But then it was simplified and slimmed down. And at that stage, there was a requirement that plans should take radical action. I can't quite remember the phrase. Take radical measures to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, something like that. And that has stayed the same until a fortnight ago, when it was actually put in the strategic bit of the document. So I think that gives us, coming back to Jane's question, that gives the leverage to do stuff that we previously, as a bunch of planners, we haven't bothered to try to do because it just didn't seem to be possible. We might fail, but sometimes it's better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all.
Great. Stuart, you put your hand up. Do you want to add something in? Hopefully it's related to climate and environment.
Ed, of course it is. Thank you. Hi, Penelope. Good to see you again. I wanted to pick up on Jane's question, actually. Jane, I'm councillor for Woburns-Bourne End and Headser, had a lot to do with Risborough Area Residents Association on your own plans. In our particular development here, I think one of the things we're endeavouring to do, back to your question, is try and hold the planning officers' feet to the fire on the local plan policies. So on our particular policy BE2, there are a number of, let's call them in the broadest sense, environmental and sustainability measures, such as link roads for public transport, open spaces, green spaces, provision, etc. And the planning applications that have come in are only, well, they're not even paying lip service to some of those provisions. And my sense, and Penelope can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you can't choose which policies in a strategic policy in a local plan. You can, the sub policies, it comes as a package. And Penelope is nodding. So in the first instance, from a Risborough point of view, I would say go back and look at the strategic policies that relate to your sites and make sure that they're delivered in full. I'm very excited about this NPPF news. I'd missed that, so I shall be taking that away. And then the party or the non-party political broadcast is there is always the ballot box, and it's great that we have so many independent councillors on this call, and Greg, I shouldn't leave you out, Greg, as well, who as part of the Impact Alliance are trying to make a difference in Buckinghamshire Council. So we're trying to do our bit.
And when it comes to the policies for both Hollands Farm, down in Bourne End and Princess Risborough, of course, you can shoot me because I was talk about poacher turned gamekeeper, because I was the person that signed off those for recommendation to council to be approved. So I hope there are not too many
bygones be bygones there, Penelope.
Well, yeah, genuinely, I hope there aren't too many loopholes. But as you say, they should be implemented as a suite and not pick and mixed. and the language should be that it is a requirement to do this, this and this, not it's an encouragement or a nice to have. So.
And just to qualify again on the NPPF's new wording on environment and climate, those local plans that come in and affect any new development, but anything that hasn't been finally determined, the new NPPF will also affect it.
Not really, because the NPPF in that paragraph is telling us what we should put in a local plan.
Right, okay.
So
Right.
It's not really changing the mood music for the determination of the application.
Okay, right, all right, thank you. Right, now I'm going to move on to, I know people have got their hands up, there's quite a lot in the chat, so I'm moving on to some of the environmental ones here. So apologies if I don't read out your question, but so Chris Black has said, notwithstanding the efforts to reduce carbon emissions, and given that climate change is not a linear problem, but a complex one, and he's put in with associated delays, how much should neighbourhood planning be centred on ongoing resilience in the context of aligning our way of being with the natural systems that embrace us? I think actually what we should be saying, to simplify it a little bit, and I hope I get the gist of it, is our neighbourhood plan should be looking both at reducing carbon emissions in the short term, but should also be looking at long-term adaptation and what can be done in the local area, bearing in mind what it may look like in 10, 20 or 30 years' time due to climate change.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The Environment Agency has for many years been having a strategy that is wholly around adaptation, very sadly, because of the fact that the government hasn't decided to deal with mitigation. They are planning for a 4-degree world, which frankly is utterly scary. And I find incredible that anybody plans for a 4-degree world. The very fact that you're having to plan for a 4-degree world shows you that you shouldn't be planning for it. But anyway, so yes, and I think that's something that also planning hasn't properly grappled with, perhaps because everybody is hoping they don't need to because the problem will go away.
Okay, just a comment from Ray Cox, but actually I'll put it to you as a question. There's lots of super polluting vehicles around, particularly the big SUVs and all that sort of thing. Is there anything we can do within the neighbourhood plan or the planning system to reduce the number of vehicles or the number of big ones?
So this comes down to indirect measures. So something that was done in Kensington and Chelsea was to require anybody that parked on street to have a vehicle that was a certain width, because these big cars are so wide that in many of the streets in Kensington and Chelsea, if you park if you've got car parking on both sides of the street and a running channel in the middle, and if you have 2 big cars, you can't actually have a functioning running channel. So they limited, if you want to have a on-street parking permit, you've got to have a car of a certain, within certain dimensions. But I don't think Hazlemere has that much on-street parking. In any event, that's a non-planning function. That's another council function that issues the permits. In terms of other ways to reduce car use, it comes down to, have you got a car club so people don't have to own the second car? Can you augment the bus service? A bus service to Hazelmere isn't that bad. It might be a matter of promoting it, but if you want to get a whole new bus service, you need something like 2,000 dwellings to support a bus service. So the opportunities for real modification of vehicular transport are difficult. But what about walking and cycling? They are the Cinderellas. I'm a proud owner of a new electric bike. I collected it on Friday. So I'm intending to be able to get to Hazelmere up. So I've got to relearn how to cycle, to be fair. I haven't cycled since I was a teenager, so it's absolutely terrifying. So it'll be a long time before I'm cycling up the hill to Hazelmere. But actually, if we could make it safer to cycle, let's change some of the traffic priorities. The highway code, I heard, is being changed so that if at any junction, you will have to give way to a pedestrian. Yeah, I've been wanting that for about 30 years. Why? It's amazing, actually, if you think about it, why that hasn't been the case. So things like that, perhaps we could then reduce the number of vehicles that are needing to be owned, and over time, they'll reduce the amount that they are used. But you do have to have that supporting infrastructure. I'm always berated for a development that was up on the Wellesbourne school site up at Kings Hill Grange, I think it is now. It was actually, to be fair to me and my colleagues, we lost it on appeal, but it simply hasn't got enough parking. But it was in the days when, long before the NPPF, we had a government guidance that was trying to restrict the number of parking spaces as the device to restrict car ownership, on the basis that you would then have to catch a bus, which actually wasn't a bad thesis. But the problem is, if you don't have the bus service, then people will just own the cars and they'll park them on the grass and the pavements, and the ambulance won't get through. And we learned that the hard way. There are a couple of developments in Wickham that are simply underparked. And you then get down to the detail when a estate agent sells the property, they may not make it clear that actually there's only one allocated space and the rest is on your own. And everyone arrives with their 2 cars and wonders, well, of course the new development must plan to have 2 parking spaces for dwelling, mustn't it? Sorry, I'm rambling. People want their key.
It looks like we've got a lot of questions though coming. And in fact, just to add one on for a qualification on that, let's imagine Hazelmere that we do put in running tracks and cycle tracks and everything else. What do we do on the edges of Hazelmere where we join Widmer End or Holt Green or Wickham?
Exactly.
Does that mean that you get off your bike and push it after that? Or what happens at the edge of your neighbourhood plan?
Yeah, and so actually putting in a cycleway is not so much something that's in the neighbourhood plan. You'd have that in another strategy, but you want to get money from a developer to implement your other strategy. So that other strategy would have to be done by the Highway Authority, and you'd have to take into account the fact that you're not going to cycle to the parish border, you're cycling to another destination. So you're cycling to a school or to the shops or and so you plan your cycle network around that. Although, putting my firm green hat on, I take exception to the fact that we assume we have to have cycle routes. Cars can drive on any road, but you have to have specific cycle routes where it's safe to cycle. And frankly, we need to just make it safe to cycle on any road. I was surprised. I went to see my niece down in Hanwell, which is in Hillingdon, Ealing, one of those boroughs. This is a 20 mile an hour blanket, 20 mile an hour speed limit, even on the dual carriageways. The whole of the borough is 20. I'm thinking, what a good idea. Why don't we simply say that our streets are 20 miles an hour? And suddenly it's much, much safer to cycle without you having to spend lots of infrastructure on cycle lanes. But again, the 20 mile, I don't think you can have a speed limit just changing on the parish boundary. I think you'd have to have a wider strategy for that.
Aidan has put in a comment about EPC. So maybe just a quick comment. Maybe you can just in 10 seconds actually explain for those who might not know what an EPC is again, and then mention if it has any place in planning, both within a neighbourhood plan system or when planning applications come into parish councils or anybody else to look and comment on things. How do you know about what an EPC is, and should it have any part of the process?
So an EPC is the Energy Performance Certificate, I think it stands for, which is the thing that when you sell your house, you rate your house. It's the same thing as when you buy a fridge and it has A, B, C, D as to how much energy it takes. It's the equivalent for a house, and it's graded A, B, C, D, E, F, I think. So when you buy a house, you know how energy efficient or inefficient it is. And the government is requiring that, I think it's by 2028, any house that is sold will have to have an EPC rating of C or above. Now, one of the key ways that the planning system works is if you have a policy requiring something and then you have an application coming in, how do you know that that policy has been met? So how the EPC would then connect into the planning system is you would say, we want all extensions to cause all houses to be retrofitted, and then you would pick your EPC rating. So then the person would go off and do their EPC rating in order to demonstrate that they met that policy. That wouldn't quite work because you can't build the building first and then do your rating. But there must be a means of checking that what you're proposing is likely to result in that rating. So there are a whole range of things like that. There's the BREEAM, the Building Research Establishment's Environmental Management Assessment Process. I can't quite remember what it stands for, which does a whole range of sustainability things against buildings. And you just say, you've got to be excellent or you've got to be very good or whatever. And then people go off and use that system as the measuring tool.
We've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to just add in a few with a couple of comments. Alison has asked if Penelope's engaged to draft Hazelmere's neighbourhood plan climate change policies. She feels a lot of clever drafting is required for it. Well, I can answer that. No, Penelope isn't employed to do that. But having said that, on the basis she's on the Hazelmere Climate Emergency Working Party, and we're obviously going to be putting in some input, we do hope that Penelope will be helping with that as we do it. Then we've had in from Jane, which I think is quite worthwhile commenting on. So local plans don't address climate and carbon, and they certainly don't currently. Can we sneak in controls on this through the neighbourhood plan, relying on the new changes to the NPPF?
Yeah, and it wouldn't be sneaking in, it would be the part of the process. If I'm right that the changes mean that we can now be more radical than the local plan could be, yes. And then again, another thing about the way the system works, the most recent plan trumps the other ones. So if you bring in a neighbourhood plan and it's more recent than, it's got policies on the same subject, but your policies are more recent than the other ones, then yours trump the other ones. The way it works. And likewise, if you had a neighbourhood plan and a district council rewrote some of those policies and it was more recent, it would trump your neighbourhood ones.
Peter comments, in the Netherlands, cars must give way to bike lanes on roundabouts, and makes a comment after that, but there's a straight question. Anything we can do on that in a neighbourhood plan?
No, I don't think you could deal with something like that. That's to do with road traffic orders. But that comes back to the change to the, I've just mentioned it, highway code. That's probably governmental. That's probably not even local government could do that.
Okay. All right. 20-mile-an-hour limits. Can we bring those in under a neighbourhood plan?
Not under a neighbourhood plan, but you would work with your transport authority, and that's where political pressure would come to bear.
Right. I have raced over quite a few people's questions, and there are people with their hands up. We have officially 1 minute left. Penelope, you happy if we stay on for another 5 to 10 minutes?
Yeah, quite happy.
We'll cut it off for certain at 10 past, in which case we can take the people with their hands up. I apologise that I didn't see who put their hand up first. So long as it's related to climate and environment as well as planning, that's absolutely great. We'll ask Catherine then to go first, and then we'll go through the other two.
Thank you, Ed. Just a couple of things, actually. Being on the planning committee at Buckinghamshire, as I am, I just wanted to highlight this because I'm just staggered by this application we had come in for an extension in Flatwell Heath for a 2-storey basement. So basically, they were going to dig up the whole garden and put 2 stories worth of concrete to build an underground swimming pool. And I just cannot believe there were very little in the way of conditioning or anything else about it to make it a net gain biodiversity, but even just ripping out that much soil out of the earth and putting in concrete was just, I struggled to get my head around it. It was just incredible. So I just wanted to kind of relay that, because I think it's really important that part of when we're looking at our neighbourhood plan, we potentially need to think about some of these oddities that may creep in as they already are starting to in other villages around. The other thing I wanted to do is, obviously, Penelope, I don't know if you know, but the Terriers Farm application is in. And I just kind of wanted to get a feel for, I know we were talking about policies that sit within that development as part of the development brief. And if we don't feel that the developers are bringing all of those policies, and they will keep saying to me, they're indicative. And I'm like, no, it's quite clear. They're not indicative. They are the policies. We can, as Stuart was saying, hold their feet to the fire, basically, and make sure that they do comply with all of the policies.
Yeah, in the end, you never comply with everything. It's just an impossibility.
Yeah.
So there will always be an on-balance decision.
Yeah, so you've got to...
but you should be doing everything you can to resolve them all and to meet them all. And then you think, well, actually, yeah, it's all right. And this is where planning gets so complicated, because it's not just a matter of applying a series of rules and out pops the answer. There is a matter of judgment.
Yeah.
And whether when you follow the letter of the law and you have to have 25% canopy cover, but you need to make sure that all your front doors are facing the street and your parking is within sight of the windows, And that means that you're actually going to get 24% canopy cover in order to meet those, or whatever. Sometimes something has to give, but it should be on the edges, and it's once everything is met to the maximum that it can be.
Okay, thank you.
And as for basements, I'd hope we don't get lots of basements around here. They are a nightmare.
Adding to that for qualification, within the neighbourhood plan, Penelope, both looking at basements, but extensions and everything else. And if we're talking about, for instance, extensions, which would be passive house or something similar, then that is actually something we put in the neighbourhood plan in the design code section, or how would you put it in?
Doesn't really matter, just so long as it's in there and so long as your plan is clear and you can easily follow, it doesn't really matter which section it's in.
So could you then distinguish for us just very quickly the difference between design code section in the neighbourhood plan and anywhere else? What's the design code section useful for?
So a design code is a separate tool to a neighbourhood plan. You wouldn't have a design code section in the neighbourhood plan. You'd have a design section in the neighbourhood plan. You may choose to introduce a design code, which is the government's latest, I was going to say gimmick. I'm allowed to say gimmick. I'm no longer employed by a local authority. I can have my own view on these matters. It's the latest attempt to try to drive up quality, especially amongst the volume house builders. And it's trying to be more, the difference between a code and a policy is the code is very, very specific. So you can measure it so that you can actually do it through machine reading and a simplified way of approval. It sounds awful, it's not actually awful, and it can be a very useful tool, but it's a separate tool to your neighbourhood plan. You may choose to do one and it would be semi-detached, but it's a separate tool.
Okay, thank you. Aidan, if you have a question, would you like to ask it?
Yes, thanks, Ed. So as a new councillor on Burnham Parish Council and a member of the planning committee on that, so I'm trying to really get my head around how we actually translate these ideas into obviously our recommendations on planning. So are you basically set, and by the way, we don't have a neighbourhood development plan at all in South Bucks. So is the process to try and develop a neighbourhood development plan and then use that effectively as a stick to hit with in terms of the actual planning process? Because at the moment, I've sat on the planning committee, looked at extension and said, oh, well, I think we should, it'd be nice to say that they've got to put solar panels on the roof or whatever, and I'm being told no, you can't do that. So
yeah, you need a new set of rules, and if you do that through a neighbourhood plan, that's one way of doing it, rather than waiting for the district-wide, as it would go, county-wide plan as it now would be.
Right. Okay. So yeah. Okay.
So let me come in. You mentioned just to qualify. Sorry, can I come in on yours, Aidan? Just to qualify, Penelope. So within a neighbourhood plan, you could require solar panels and heat pumps, etc., to be put in with new buildings.
You could require some councils have successfully, under the previous regime, if I can put it that way, have required a percentage of renewables. And I don't see why, especially now that the things are becoming clearer and the rules are becoming, the NPPF is clearer and the 6th carbon budget is more extreme. I can't see why you couldn't do that. I'm just being a bit hedgy because that's a very specific question. But you could certainly do some stuff in your neighbourhood plan that does more on climate change than is currently in the local plan. Right.
And Penelope, just on specific, you mentioned one thing, that so if somebody puts forward a plan for an extension, which is very common, that we try and impose a planning condition that they have to bring up the rest of the house to at least an EPC of level C, which I think is a great idea. But people only get EPCs done when they sell a house normally, don't they? So you're not going to know what the EPC is anyway.
So they'd have to do it. If that was the tool that was used, you'd have to get your EPC done on your existing dwelling. And then there must be a tool that's an equivalent to an EPC. There is, because it's related to the building regs. when you do your energy assessment. So there are tools that are available, and we just build them into the planning system rather than just being in the building reg system.
Okay, so just to finish off this sort of question I've got, so probably what I should do is to try talk to my fellow councillors, perhaps ask them to read the new NPPF.
Yeah, that's simply one paragraph. It's about 3 words in one paragraph that's changed.
Right, okay. But maybe to try and get get local councillors and other local people to I mean, I don't even know the process of putting forward a neighbourhood development plan, but that's what we should try and get off the ground.
I think the first thing would be for your parish to declare a climate emergency.
Right.
And then it gives you a remit when you do your neighbourhood plan to do something on climate. Otherwise, why is climate so important to the people in your neck of the woods?
Same as anyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm putting the skeptic's hat on, so get your climate emergency declared first, and then that gives you a reason why you want to do a climate friendly neighbourhood plan.
Right, okay.
And just to throw in on Aidan's question then, Penelope, if let's say we said all extensions, and you've heard this from me before, but it'd be nice to hear your answer today. If we made all extensions had to be passive house, so the highest level of insulation, etc., you couldn't do an extension if you hadn't got the whole of the building as passive house. It's a bit like you were talking about the EPC. Could we stick that into the neighbourhood plan?
We'd have to check what the viability was on extensions. So the cost of doing passive house is a lot higher than a normal extension. And it might be that would be regarded as making it unviable for anybody to do an extension, and that wouldn't be allowed. So we'd have to do some work. What I'm not aware that anyone's done is taken a whole life cycle cost. So yes, it might be more expensive to build, but you then wouldn't have your energy costs for the next 20 years. And if you took that into account, would it change the viability calculation? And would some clever lawyer decide that actually that's not good enough and it's still no good for some reason? But that's the sort of thing we need to start exploring.
Very much like the comment on that, actually. It's a bit like that everyone's saying that electric cars are more expensive than having a normal fossil fuel car. But if you buy a second-hand electric car, you get all your money back within 3 or 4 years because it's so much cheaper to run.
Yeah.
So suddenly it changes the game. Okay, probably the last question then. Andy, if you're ready to ask a question, have you got a short question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Right, okay. Hopefully it's fairly short. Yeah, you'll have probably seen in the media today, yesterday, the reaction to the extension of permitted development rights for commercial and retail. Some of you may be aware that the Town and Country Planning Association have been working with a cross-party group of parliamentarians on the Healthy Homes Bill to try and introduce high-level healthy homes principles across new developments and change of use developments. But they're also very keen to work with local authorities at all tiers to try and see if those principles can be adopted into local plans, both neighbourhood plans and other vehicles. So I can email you the links to the details of the Healthy Homes principles. TCP are very keen to work with us at Prince's Risborough, and will be talking to us at some point in the near future about how we might go about that. One way would be to introduce those into the neighbourhood plan, but another might be to try and get them integrated into the pilot design codes that are being developed across Buckinghamshire as well. So if anyone's involved in that process, I think it'd be good to explore the feasibility of that as well. So that's not really a question, although I'd be keen to hear Penelope's thoughts about it.
It's a really great idea, really, really great idea, because it's a good framework that covers all the aspects of healthy homeship, and it's well respected. So that would be a good basis to start.
Right,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're pretty much drawing it to a close, but I will just ask you to comment briefly, Penelope, if you know, because Trevor and Khalil have asked about funding things. So Trevor's asked, how do you get funding for a neighbourhood plan? Khalil has asked about a neighbourhood plan would also allow parish councils to apply for 25% SIL funding. Do you happen to know the answers to that?
So you get funding for a neighbourhood plan through an organisation called Localis. localis, and you get about £9,000 per neighbourhood plan, I think, but you can sometimes put in 2 bids, I understand. I'm not that familiar with the process, but that is something like the truth. And what was the other question? Short-term memory, dreadful.
About the sill.
Oh yes. So yes, you can take of any houses that are built in your patch, you get 25%.
Right, great. Penelope, I think we'll draw it to a close. We'll finish there with Jane's comment. Apparently passive houses are now about the same price per metre squared. So
Okay.
maybe the prices have come down to be more manageable for everybody.
Yeah.
Right, Penelope, thank you very, very much. And thank you everybody for the questions, both challenging and otherwise. A big encouragement to all those communities that aren't already engaged on doing a neighbourhood plan to go ahead and do one. I think that the view of all those of us in Hazelmere is this is our one opportunity to take some control of the planning system into our own hands, particularly for the benefit of the climate and environmental issues, but also for the general benefit of the community in creating an environment that they want. So we would encourage everybody else to copy us, and hopefully some ideas for all those of us here from Hazelmere for what we're going to do. So thank you so much, Penelope, again, for doing the talk. That was brilliant. And you stepped in at the last minute as well, because we didn't have our talk sorted out for this week. Please, anybody who is from Hazelmere or surrounding that would like to help in relation to what we're doing on a climate emergency working party, we have 1,001 things we want to do, and we are always looking for more hands to help us do it. And if you're on here from Hazelmere and you can't help and you know somebody else who might want to help, then please do put them in touch. We have lots of things to do, whether it's in getting our hands dirty, planting, whether it's working on plans related to getting ourselves to net zero, or whether it's related to climate issues in the neighbourhood plan. So please do get in touch and start getting involved. We'll all look forward to seeing you again if you'd like to come. We do these talks every single month at 6 p.m. on the first Monday of the month, unless there's a bank holiday, then it's the following Monday. So please watch out, particularly on Facebook, because those of you who might have come here after an email, I don't always manage to email everybody before it happens, but do put it on Facebook. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye. Thanks for your questions. Bye.